I run a public health think tank, the American Council on Science and Health, a plug, acsh.org, please check it out. And we're an anti-smoking group. And I always get frustrated when my colleagues in the tobacco control community get so vexed about how, isn't it terrible that the cigarette companies are making all this money off of death? They're so angry about all this money they're making off of death. And I say, well, it's not their money making that bothers me, it's the death that bothers me. And if they did it for free, I'd be anti-smoking too. And I think it's the same thing here. That I don't have a problem if they're getting industry-funded research. I don't care if they're on the board of directors of Public Citizen. Get the science right, and I don't care what the potential bias is, because the whole point of bias is it's a red flag for getting the science wrong. And let's really look under the hood. Let's look at all the data. Let's look at the methodology. And not use a shortcut, which is done in the press, okay? And the shortcut is it was industry-funded or it wasn't industry-funded. And if it was industry-funded, not so sure about the credibility of that study. At least that's the way it comes across in the paper. And if it was funded by, some nonprofit, well, how could it be wrong? It was funded by a nonprofit, because we ignore all the other biases. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a real problem for patients. And I've talked with senior officials at the Food and Drug Administration who have claimed that they are handcuffed, that their hands are tied, especially with regard to FDA panels. And we talked about the Vioxx panel before. Because essentially what you've got left is you've got scientists who have worked for industry are afraid to serve on the FDA panels because they're going to get attacked, they're going to be seen as non-credible. So now you've got FDA panels which are made up exclusively of scientists who have never worked with industry, either because they're not good enough to get hired by industry, or they're so anti-industry that they're unwilling to work for industry. And you've got panels that are skewed, with people who are either not qualified or anti-industry in the first place. And that, I would argue, doesn't serve consumers. I mean, we're all here to serve our patients, to serve your patients. And having FDA panels that are skewed against industry because they're either not qualified or they have ideological bias, I don't think serves patients. And I think that's really the problem. And it seems to be that this bias is always this argument against bias is always very one-sided, and unfortunately, and I don't want to get political, but I think it is political. I mean, Congressman Dingell has been an advocate against this whole conflicts of interest. He's been together with Waxman, who just beat him out for the committee post. But Congressman Dingell has been a leader in charging against conflicts of interest. Now, CBS News reported just earlier this week that Congressman Dingell, who is leading the charge in favor of the bailout of the automakers, he's from Michigan, his wife has been a lobbyist for GM and actually became a GM executive. Now, I would argue that that's a conflict of interest, and maybe Congressman Dingell shouldn't be the one doing this. Now you can point to all the funding that Congressman Dingell got from the auto industry, and maybe he's not credible because of that. But maybe, in his defense, he's a congressman from Michigan. Of course he's getting donations from the auto industry. Does that make him biased, or is he trying to save jobs back home? It's not such a clear-cut case that he, just because his wife is an executive at GM, and just because he's received campaign contributions from the automakers, is he therefore biased in favor of GM? I don't think he is. I think he's maybe biased in favor of his constituency. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. And I think the same thing applies to these FDA panels. I mean, Dr. Miles made a very cogent argument about the Vioxx case, about the FDA panels, and you saw two slides. One slide said that the non-industry tied panelists were against Vioxx coming back to market, and the ones who did have FDA ties were almost all in favor of it. And he said, well, that raises questions. And sure, let it raise questions, but let me suggest a possible answer to those questions. And that is that the scientists who generally are in favor of weighing risks and benefits about pharmaceuticals and understand that all drugs have risks, and you have to weigh them in each case and let patients make that decision, that maybe those scientists who did have industry ties and recognized the complexity of weighing risks and benefits were the same scientists who happened to have worked for industry. And the ones who were so pure that never had any industry ties were not capable of making those distinctions. I just wrote a piece about Fred Barron, Fred Barron was a plaintiff's lawyer, not just a plaintiff's lawyer, but he was leading the charge in the plaintiff's bar movement. And this gets a little bit beyond the issue of conflicts of interest necessarily, but as Dr. Miles went a little bit past that, talking about the money that industry makes, I just want to make a point about the plaintiff's bar and their role in all of this, and a little bit of an irony. Fred Barron, his name was in the news recently. He was the campaign contributor to John Edwards, who was making sure that the mistress, Rielle Hunter, I didn't have Britney Spears, so I had to talk about a mistress. That Rielle Hunt, he was the one paying off Rielle Hunter, John Edwards' mistress, and he was a big campaign contributor to John Edwards, and he was really leading the charge in the plaintiff's bar movement. And he has a whole section on his website about suing pharmaceutical industry. It was a big charge. Now, he was in the position, probably like Dr. Miles, that these drugs so many drugs are dangerous, and the pharmaceutical industry understates the dangers of the drugs. Well, what happened is, Dr. Barron, unfortunately, had cancer, and he found out about a drug called Tysabri, you may have heard of, that in early clinical trials showed some promise, off-label, for his type of cancer. So he wanted to get some, and he was near death, unfortunately. He couldn't get any because the company, Biogen, that sells this drug, had taken it off the market a couple of years earlier because it's an MS drug, and it's a very effective MS drug for patients who couldn't get help by any other things. And this gets to that area of weighing risks and benefits. The drug was pulled from the market because of these risks for MS patients. It was pulled from the market for MS patients because of certain very rare but fatal disease that you would get from taking Tysabri. And MS patients were outraged, and they went to their doctors and said, can you get me any of this stuff? They rebelled, even though it was off the market. Eventually, Biogen came back on the market, and there was a process, and Biogen was not allowed to sell it for anything other than MS. So now you've got these clinical trials that showed some promise for the type of cancer that Fred Barron had, and all of a sudden, this guy who was out there leading the charge in the plaintiff's bar against the pharmaceutical industry wanted to get some, and Biogen said, sorry, we can't sell it to you. Well, he was a very powerful, politically connected man. He got Senator Hillary Clinton, former President Bill Clinton, Andrew Von Essenbach of the FDA, and Lance Armstrong to call Biogen and say, get him some of this stuff. And he got it. Unfortunately, either it didn't work or it was too late, and he passed away on October 30th. And that's unfortunate. But it was the plaintiff's bar and the anti-industry activists who are responsible for taking away choices from consumers. Dr. Barron, the irony is that attorney Fred Barron created this environment where Biogen, because of a threat of litigation or strong regulatory action, was afraid to sell the drug to this man who was dying. And then, of course, there are arguments to defend Biogen for not selling it because he wasn't part of the clinical trial and all of that. But Fred Barron created that environment where he couldn't get the drug. He was able to use his political power to get the drug. Unfortunately, it didn't help him. But consumers, the rest of us, other patients, don't have that political power. And I think it kind of goes back to weighing risks and benefits and understanding the dangers of drugs and understanding that these decisions need to be made in that in that very private place between a doctor and a patient, weighing risks and benefits. And I think this attack on industry-funded science is part of that whole anti-industry campaign, which I think undermines the interest of patients, which is, I think, where there's common ground here, is that we're all interested in what's in the consumer's best interest and what's in the patient's best interest. And I would argue, in conclusion, that this effort to demonize any industry-funded research and to do so without the balance of equal skepticism of other types of potentials for bias does not serve the patient's best interest. And I look forward to taking some questions.